rock recordings? What's that? Rock recordings?
Sure.
Oh, sure, whatever.
Why not?
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for being here on this lovely Friday with AC/DC covers in the background. We'll see if we can compete with this. I just want to say thank you to Clifford for having me here. My name is Hank Shteamer. I'm a writer, old friend of Cliff's. We've been kind of in the trenches working on this stuff for quite a long time. Probably met 20-some years ago. And it's a great honor to both of us, I'm sure, to have Matt Shipp up here to celebrate this new book, Black Mystery School Pianists, and then also Cliff's book, which came out, was it last year or 2023?
2023.
2023, okay, so yeah, so...
It's old news.
Yeah, and I read Cliff's book when it came out a couple years ago, but it was really cool to reread it in the past week or so alongside Matt's book. If you're not familiar with these, basically it's Matt's book of his own writings and Cliff's book about Matt's work. So you're getting this kind of really interesting 360-degree perspective on, 40-some years of great music. But I thought that maybe we could start, the title essay of Matt's book is really fascinating, and I really was struck by it in a lot of ways, but one thing I was thinking about, I'd love to just sort of hear where the idea for that essay came from, and was it something that you were had in the back of your mind for many years, or just sort of how did this idea of the Black Mystery School come together? And for people who aren't familiar, maybe we could just sort of start with that.
First of all, I just want to say Clifford's book is about my work on one particular record label.
Exactly.
The French label Robart. I was kind of, not raised, that's not the right word, but there's mentors I had, not people I actually studied with, but just older people I knew when I was a teenager who were very kind of mysterious people. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, and there was a guy I knew who was a janitor, and he used to put a lot of things in my head. And he used to always talk about Monk being the ultimate, Thelonious Monk being the ultimate example of an iconoclast type of person that followed his own vision. And he always told me he thought he saw that in me. Now, when I was a teenager, my style was somewhere between Bill Evans and McCoy Tyner. And I was doing straight ahead gigs. I knew where I wanted to go, but I was not there yet. And he used to always tell me to use Monk as a model of dogged determination to get a path and follow it. And then he used to talk a lot about Andrew Hill also. This is without him, I came up with that term, Black Mystery School Pianist, but without him coming up with that term, this one guy who was, again, when I was in the University of Delaware, he was a janitor there, and I saw him playing piano one time in the practice rooms, and I just knocked on his door and we started talking, and then he kind of took me under his wings, just kind of the same way in the old TV series Kung Fu. He was always the guy grasshopper. The older teacher, it was kind of like that. He's somebody that will never be known to history or any, But so he also used to talk about Andrew Hill a lot as someone who was this really special kind of mysterious figure in jazz history that history would never kind of really figure out where to put him in. So he kind of put the seeds of that in my head without using that term. And then years later, believe it or not, I read a boxing essay about certain types of fighters that, and I'm a big boxing fan, certain types of fighters that couldn't get big fights back in the day, so they fought each other a lot, and they used to travel around in kind of different circuits, and they all became great defensive fighters because they were really fighting, but they had to kind of keep themselves healthy because they couldn't get the big fights, so they all fought, so it was like this kind of, and they were all black fighters also, so it was kind of this black underground school of fighting also that was it was just very interesting. So it got me thinking, in terms of how there's always like kind of an underground as opposed to a mainstream of people that follow a certain type of path and code, and then the seeds of like, and then I just started, it started hitting me that like, hey, Herbie Nichols was around the same time Monk did. You know, his music is a kind of classic. He actually wrote the first essay ever of Monk, and I started just seeing connections between there, and then the idea of that essay fell together for me. So that's how it happened. And also, you know, just the fact that I always thought of Mal Waldron and Randy Weston as related, even though they sound so different and they're just completely different. There always just seemed to me to be some type of thread that connected them in history. And then I got to know Rand Blake, who is not black, but I actually include him in that essay. And you know, Rand used to babysit for Monk's daughter, and he was close to Mal Waldron, and Rand loved Randy Weston, and yeah, so I just like things kind of fell together in my head in terms of how this. So I mentioned that idea in like a few articles over the years, never kind of really went deep into it. And Frank Oteri, who was running newmusic.org, thought it was an interesting idea, and he kept begging me to kind of try to structure an essay around it. And I started, and I just didn't feel like doing it. And I told him a few times, like, no, I can't do it, you know. And he kept pushing me, and I finally did it, and it worked out.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating piece, and the Andrew Hill bit, you know, he's a particular favorite of mine. I think anyone who is kind of looking to delve into this stuff, like maybe would be a good first stop. There's an amazing, can I read a little part of this? Like, there's an amazing part where you say, yeah, Andrew Hill is someone who managed to slip through all the cracks and defy any category, though it is obvious what he comes out of. In some ways, his playing is the ultimate fuck you to everything and everyone. I really enjoyed that. I feel like you listen to Andrew Hill, and it's not overtly like iconoclastic, but it's more like under the surface, and I found it really interesting how you characterize that. But I think a thing about this essay that I really like, and I'm curious to hear Cliff's take on this, is like, I feel like when you're reading about jazz, there's so much of critics defining the terms, categories that artists are placed into, where it's like, you know, this is the free, this is the in, the out, the mainstream, whatever. But I think it's really kind of challenging and exciting to have an artist sort of like pushing back and saying, like, actually, no, I'm creating my own category for myself, and I'm not going to accept like the sort of cookie cutter ways that this music is like classified. I mean, does that bring up anything for you?
So for me, actually, what it brought up was, and it's a little different because Matt is looking historically back at a number of his forebears, but what I was thinking about when I read it, and I still think about it, is the artist Donald Judd and his essay from, I think it's 1965, Specific Objects, where he starts out, half or more of the best new work is neither painting nor sculpture. And at that time, he was trying to define himself and a number of his peers in a post-abstract expressionist realm. And it's a little different because they were all working at the same time and kind of trying to define themselves, you know, in relation to, like, you know, Pollock and de Kooning and all of these figures who had preceded them. But the idea of a kind of a neither nor-ness of canonization is really fascinating to me. Almost an opening up of a void of possibility, and I think that's what Matt's essay also really lays out in an art historical context, and the fact that, yeah, we can all find, like, well, oh, why isn't Chris Anderson mentioned in here? Why isn't so-and-so mentioned in here? It's like, oh, you know, you can fill in the blanks of how you want to extend that lineage, but either way, it is certainly outside of the parameters of canonization that we have historically set forth, and it also allows a a freeing of structure, because all of these musicians are very different and they don't necessarily adhere to any sort of prevailing copycat approach. And it also defines Matt's work as a pianist importantly, although some of these musicians are not his peers, they're somewhat long deceased. It's also a staking out of one's claim within the broader history of the music, and that is where I align it with Judd and some other artists' writings of that period.
Can I say one other thing? I didn't realize this till after I wrote the essay, but I think the seeds of the Slurred Planet, when I was a kid, I watched a PBS special with Oscar Peterson, and it was Oscar Peterson with Andre Previn on PBS, and Peterson was basically saying he carries the mantle from Art Tatum, and supposedly Art Tatum said, after me it's you, and so when you're growing up, if you're a pianist and if you're studying, when you're young, it's hard to process all the information. It's just all this stuff out here, and you're trying to make sense of what different things are. And it always hit me, and I didn't realize this till later, that in trying to not define, but just point out that there's an alternative kind of history or way of looking at things, an alternative touch, people that don't necessarily come out of a classical paradigm. What hit me later was the dichotomy between Oscar Peterson and Monk is actually the defining point. And what really brought that home to me was when I thought of, I think they both did blindfold tests, and I think I remember reading this. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. They played Monk for Oscar Peterson in a blindfold test, and his answer was, "I love Monk's tunes when Hank Jones plays them." And then they played Oscar Peterson for Monk, and his answer was, "What's the closest way to the toilet?" And that is all I have to say. Somebody could check if I'm right. I think.
Right.
Okay. So it really hit me that and what was really fascinating to me, especially that Monk comes out of stride, is that, and then, Oscar Peterson actually hung out with Art Tatum, and supposedly Tatum gave him the mantle. Now, Tatum could have been just a nice guy, and he liked Oscar Peterson and thought he could play well, and said that one night. I mean, who knows, I'm not saying that, Oscar Peterson made that up, but Tatum was a very idiosyncratic player in and of, and there's not really a school of Art Tatum. I mean, what he did is really falls under his fingers and is a process of his central nervous system. And some of it is like, there's rhythmic drawing rhythmic effects and harmonic effects in Tatum. So the fact, I mean, if I'm going to be cruel, which I can be, you could say that Oscar Peterson kind of flattened out some of that, and maybe it's more of a presentation for a wider. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm saying you could say that, but you can also look at Monk from really being a standard bearer from a lot of people from the Stride School too, obviously in a more abstract way, spaced out in a modernistic way. And just the fact that they both said that about each other, and I mean, that was the real crux of it. So I really, and this is after I wrote the essay, I realized I was kind of reacting to being confused as a teenager, because Oscar Peterson kind of carries forward a different paradigm with a different type of training that, I mean, people always talk about Horowitz really loving Art Tatum, but yet Art Tatum was very idiosyncratic in his own way. I didn't realize that till after I wrote the essay, but that Oscar Peterson-Monk dichotomy kind of worked its way into there without bringing Oscar Peterson's name up.
Yeah, I think in some ways, what you're saying is it's like the school of pianists that lean into their eccentricity is really hard to just kind of celebrate that versus the ones that kind of try to filter it out, in some ways. Yeah. One of the absolute coolest things about both these books, especially reading them side by side, is the way that they evoke this kind of downtown New York milieu of, let's say, the 80s. And, just so it's clear if you haven't read these, both of these books have, Cliff's book has interviews with a bunch of people around Matt's orbit, and also Matt's book has a foreword by Yuko Otomo, a poet who has been part of the scene forever, and she figures pretty heavily into both these books. I guess I'd love to hear, and you've also got that great essay here about going to dance clubs in the 80s, which is one of the, just a fascinating piece, like that people might not know that part of your background. But I guess I'd love to hear from both of you, like delving into that history and that kind of like 80s New York thing, 70s and 80s New York thing that kind of birthed this scene. And you both do it so well in different ways. I'd love to hear just you both talk about, the importance of those roots and like telling these stories through that history. So whoever wants to go.
Yeah.
Well, Clifford in his book actually does a brilliant historical breakdown of what I moved to New York in '83, the end of '83. So what I walked into, because the New York quote out of free jazz, if you want to call it black, there's a lot of Caucasians, involved. But it has a history way before I moved there. And I moved into a very fertile vortex, and Clifford does a brilliant job of kind of bringing in some of the characters, talking about the actual sociology that I walked into, because how can you talk about music without talking about all the factors, including and then what Clifford did is so vital that there's another writer, it hasn't been published, who picked up on it and has done like a 25-page essay that gets into actual like the real estate and stuff and squatters and how the music was around that, and that piece I can't wait till it's published. But the crux of all that is I moved to New York in the late 80s. William Parker, the great bassist, was kind of the center of the scene, but those guys couldn't, they couldn't get anything happening. They were not being written about. They were kind of doing a do-it-yourself thing within the neighborhood, but it was all that, it was kind of an offshoot of the loft jazz scene of the 70s, but done in a very peculiar Lower East Side way with our own flavor. I walked into the middle of that, and I have my own peculiar way, and I'm also extremely ambitious, which a lot of the people in the scene, I'm not going to say they aren't ambitious, because they want to work and make money, but they might not have had as focused of a mindset about making a name as I did. But that scene does have roots in kind of things in the Lower East Side with squatting, with anarchists. I used to go to the ABC Memorial, and when I was young, I considered myself an anarchist. Now I'm involved with very bourgeois politics, because I got older and I got a little more realistic in my view about certain things. But Clifford really breaks down exactly like a lot of the factors that kind of the people that before I moved in the neighborhood were dealing with, and then how my energy might be a little different, and kind of taking those things a little different way. What Hank brought up about my essay is when I moved to New York in '83, I didn't really start touring until '89 or '90 really, when I joined the David S. Ware Quartet. So those years I was working as an art school model at Strand Bookstore and Barnes & Noble as a messenger, practicing and then hanging out at night. So I actually became kind of a club kid in New York, and I was hanging out at the Pyramid, Danceteria, the World, a bunch of dance clubs, and the same circle, Basquiat, in that world. I was hanging out with all those guys and in that circle, and that has nothing to do with jazz, but it is in a very, New York was a very creative vortex of just energy and people open to anything. So that did feed into the music, because I was just hanging out with crazy, or not, artistically inspired scenesters, and it's just kind of a very fascinating sociology in and of itself outside of the jazz stuff. But I go into that in my book, and Clifford really delves deeply into the Lower East Side and all of that.
Thank you for all that. As for me, and obviously I'm quite a bit younger and didn't experience things as directly at that time. I mean, when I first visited New York, I was terrified, like, 5-year-old or 6-year-old, just didn't understand like what all these buildings and noises were. But yeah, I've always been fascinated by these sort of echoes of history in places ever since I was young. Going to things that were seemed abandoned or derelict or what have you, trying to figure out what lives were lived there and what the spaces looked like. So I've just had a peculiar fascination with that, and as far as how I engaged with the music or the milieu that Matt stepped into. I mean, it was certainly through the eyes of a lot of other people whose lives and works I have great respect for, and let them tell their stories. And I, as an archivist in my day-to-day life as well, just try to triangulate between first-person narratives and my like ghostly experience of walking these spaces and trying to imagine what might have occurred there. I mean, we keep these places and these environments alive through our experiences that are maybe somewhat removed, but they do give it a lot of breath and so forth. And I think that with the music too, like this maybe historicization of certain musical endeavors, they'd be dead if we weren't paying attention to them in this way. So.
And I just want to say one thing. One group that Jamil Moondock, Roy Campbell, William Parker, and Rashid Bukhar, that band was a real like Lower East Side kind of archetype, and a lot of things. They never got their due, but a lot of things that define kind of the Lower East Side sound, what some people might think of as the Vision Festival sound, if there's such a thing. They kind of were the creators of that.
Yeah, I should say it's cool that we're doing this now because I believe the Vision Festival starts in like 3 days or something like that.
Right. Yeah, Monday.
And Matt's playing at it next week in New York, so definitely go check that out. I think the thing you're saying about sort of like paying witness and stuff, I was really sort of like touched by, there's stuff, a thing that comes up in both these books is this like, Steve Dalchinsky obviously, kind of looms large in both these books, but this thing about him having, the late poet who was an integral part of this scene that we're talking about. But there was a discussion in both the books about like an open air bookstore that he had, which I had not heard about before these books. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that like, if you don't hear it from someone who's there, you don't know what it was all about. And like, I just think there's something really important about preserving the narrative of those kinds of just like, I don't know, it just seems like a very pre-internet kind of thing. It's like people were just, do you have anything can you like sort of evoke that?
Okay, well, it wasn't, Steve Dalchinsky used to sell books, records mainly, outside of this building on Spring Street, and he was joined by another poet named Harry Noodle, who was a rare book dealer, but Harry lived in that building and the landlord let them sell. So Harry was selling really great art books, a lot of collector's items and stuff, and Steve had albums and books, but Ming was the album guy. And they would be out every day selling, and everybody would go by. So, I used to see James Bodomer there all the time. Even John Cage would walk by sometimes. A lot of people would, and so it got to be a thing where people would stop and talk to Steve and Harry, and it became like an open salon of ideas all day. They were out there to make money and selling books and records. And Basquiat used to walk by and buy records from Steve, and Steve would suggest jazz records, and they ended up getting in a couple of really big fights. And Steve told about John Michel that he was the most arrogant, person he ever met in his life, and then they didn't talk anymore, and John Michel was dead 2 weeks later. But anyway, a lot of people, and it was a real sharing of ideas, and all kinds of people would walk by. It was Soho, in the day. So it both was, where their job of sorts, and it was an open air salon and exchange of ideas. And I used to hang out there, talk to Steve. That's how I met him. I stopped and bought some records, and then we started talking, and then, we became like best friends. And I met a lot of people, just, and I mean, he even, like, I think one day Mick Jagger walked by and Steve was selling some bootleg tapes. And Mick went to a payphone and called a lawyer. And one day Steve got in a big argument with Courtney Love on the street. So, everybody walked by there, and Steve, a lot of times would engage in conversation. And then if you knew Steve, you would stop by and talk to him, and Lord knows who would stop. David Byrne, obviously I think he lived in Soho. You would see him walking by sometimes. So, it was a really kind of, like, you never knew what was going to happen. I mean, anything could happen. There's a tape on YouTube of RuPaul talking about the pyramid, which I used to hang on, and he would say that, you would just go out at night, and you would just, in the 80s, you would just, this is pre-internet, and you would just run into somebody in the street, and it's sort of like, where are you headed? And they would be like, well, Warhol's doing a thing at a bookstore signing, so you would plan to go there, but you would go up there, and then you would meet somebody else, and you would end up in a party, and you would never even end up at the bookstore, and he was just talking about how you would just go out, and things would just happen on the street. And that is how New York was back then. I remember the energy of that, and it was really fantastic. I have such nostalgia for pre-internet, pre-cell phone days. And, a lot of stuff we did in the internet, if people had cell phones, were taking photos of. In the pyramid, we wouldn't have been doing it.
Yeah, for me, I first started coming to New York as an adult in the mid '90s, and I think the Vision Festival was really an introduction to that entire scene. So, and I have fond memories of seeing Jamil Moondock. I think the first Vision Festival I went to, seeing him with like Khan Jamal and so forth, the Revolt of the Negro Lawn Jockeys band. Yeah, great record. And saw Jamil many times over the years, and it didn't just to bring it back to Muntu and the centrality of that chapter to the whole unfolding of Singularity Codex is that it took me, although I always really enjoyed seeing Jamil perform and really loved his recordings, interviewed him once for a separate project because he's since passed on. How crucial he was to the unfolding of what this music is was not entirely clear to me until I started talking to other musicians, and each one of them began to just independently mention how crucial Jamil Moondock and his work were to their own conception of what music could be, and what the environment really was about, and that their ethic, and that really through talking to people really did a number on me as far as helping me frame some of these ideas. And I think that's what I really took from this process too, was just the engaging real people in their own experiences of this world that they have occupied for however many years, and the connections that they developed, and let that really tell the story.
I think, you're talking about sort of like following these paths, like in your research. I think one of the really interesting things about Clifford's book is just how kind of like diverse it is in its approaches, like just sort of it's like, a little bit of history, a little bit of like interviews, a little bit of like criticism. Like I'm curious, just as I'd love to know a little bit about how you tackled this, like structurally, just because you're coming at this from a lot of different angles, and I'm interested to hear about how the book came together, like, the tactics that you decide to use and like the order you put things in and all that, because I think it weaves together really well, but it's not necessarily like an intuitive structure that you would, you know what I mean? So I'd love to hear about that. Just
Before Clifford answers that, I wanted to say I think the results of that is structurally a really original book. And that's what juices me up about Clifford's book. I think it's the whole structure and how it goes together is just really unique. I don't know of any jazz book that holds together in that way. So I'll let him answer how he did the voodoo.
Yeah, the magic of juju, as Archie Shipp titled an album. No, I didn't know what the hell I was doing.
That helps.
Yeah, so it's the first book I ever wrote. So, but part of it, yeah, the project unfolded because Matt asked me, in part, he had been doing work for this label, recording for this label, Rogart, and wanted to sort of have a cap on what that whole recording arc would be. And there was also another book he and Steve Dalchinsky did that's related, and Matt's also interviewed in one of William Parker's books for Rogart, for the label publisher. So the idea was to really cap it off with a volume, but what would that volume entail? So I had interviewed and gotten to know Matt and his music over a number of years. Been listening to him for a long time and got to know him more when I moved to New York in 2012. But yeah, I structured it in the best way I knew how, and kind of let the interviews and the conversations with Matt and other musicians help dictate that. And as an archivist, I'm also practiced in the art of a finding aid. So you develop a creator sketch of who brought the collection together, whose papers or materials one is looking at, and then a scope and content note which follows the life of the papers themselves and the material, like the actual materie of the archives, and then a catalog, which would in this case be a critical catalog of the recordings that Matt did for Rogart. So I sort of modeled it off of that, but I really, didn't know what the fuck I was doing, and I was like, well, this feels right, so this is how I'm gonna do it.
I will say that I think there's something cool about, I think that sometimes in music writing, especially jazz writing, there can be, maybe you two have thoughts or opinions on this, there can be a little bit of a tension or adversarial relationship between the people who make the music and the people who write about it. There's sometimes things can get weird and tense, but I think there's something inspiring about like a more collaborative relationship between people who write about something and people who practice it. I've never wanted to be like on some other side of the fence from the musician to someone who writes about music, and I think it's cool that this speaks to a more like collaborative, kind of cooperative relationship. I mean, do either of you have thoughts about that?
Well, through the process, obviously, Clifford and I talked a lot, and I always told him I trusted. He interviewed me massively. We got together for dinner once a week and we talked a long time. Stuff. Sometimes I told him to turn the microphone off, and stuff I just went to make sure it never got in the book. But and he interviewed a lot of people in my circle, people that I've worked with for years that know a lot about me. Some of the stuff they know about me, I wouldn't want in a book. But I stayed out of that. I mean, it's nothing bad, but the trust. I had absolute trust, both in his ability to pull it off and dealing with the materials in a responsible way. And when he said cap off, I've been recording for this label since they started. I was friends with Michelle DeBon, who started the label since the late 90s, and I've done 25. How many albums am I on?
25.
I'm
yeah.
on 25, or I did 25.
You're on, there are 25.
There's 25 albums I'm on, and I think I'm a leader on like 20, 21
Yeah.
of them.
Sounds
And
about right.
I decided it was time to end my recording relationship with that label. And, you know, I thought it would be a good idea to cap it off with a book about, and that way and the book definitely states that I'm finished, so I can't like call a producer up and try to get some extra money for an extra album. No, but yeah, it felt like the end of that body of work. You know, whatever that label brought out in me, that last album I did felt like the end, and I, you know, thought it. And that's 25 albums. It's a lot, and it's with a lot of different people. So I felt there was a rich body of material as far as the different personalities involved and the different themes covered in the different albums. And then, you know, it's a relationship, a French label, a Black American guy that lives in the Lower East Side. There's all kinds of tangents to be discovered. And I also felt, you know, Clifford understood all those because we had talked about various things in relation to all the themes in the book over the years. So that's that.
Yeah, I think you can definitely feel in the book, like not just the actual interviews that you did with Matt, but just like the time you spent in that board. But you know, it's all kind of just like, it's all kind of just there under the surface, even if it's not exactly stated. So you can feel that time you spent. I think that another thing I maybe want to touch on a little bit is like this book. There are, you know, like we talked about the title. Let's say there's instances where you're commenting on other piano players. There's stuff on Paul Bley. There's stuff on other people. But there's also like quite a bit of really intense, sort of like heady stuff about your process and kind of like, you know, we talked at the beginning about rooting you in this like jazz piano tradition, but there's a whole other thing where you're like, I have no influences. Actually, my influences are more like cosmic, religious, etc. And obviously, we can't go into all that now, and people should buy the book and read about that because this stuff is honestly like, it's fascinating to hear someone like talking about their process so in such like a lucid but also kind of like mind-blowing way. Like I wish we had these books for like all the other pianists we're talking about, but we have it for Matt Shipp. I guess I'd love, you know, if you could talk a little bit about these theories and concepts behind discovering your process of improvisation, and just give people a little taste of that that they'll read more about in the book.
Well, okay. I mean, I do. The Paul Bley piece was an obituary I actually wrote for him for Jazz Times, or not an obituary, but they have a remembrance issue every year where they have. So and Paul Bley is one of my favorite pianists. There's a little piece on Monk, and there's a really little kind of thing on Sun Ra. But the book actually, more than being about jazz, and it's about the creative process. So I deal with it obviously from my standpoint since I'm writing it, and I don't know anybody else's creative. I know what I go through, and it's really about how I deal with energy and the visions that come to me and how I translate them to music. Now, Hank mentioned a poem in there, I have no influences. If you read that poem, it sounds very egotistical. I'm basically saying I have a direct connection to God, and I don't deal with like influences like, you know, put a record on, listen to something like that. I directly beam channel. Now, I mean, okay, that poem, if you look at it as a metaphor, a prose poem, because I don't consider myself a poet, anybody can say that. I mean, if we come out, if the Big Bang is correct cosmology, then the universe was a singularity and we were all interconnected in a dimensionless point. So anybody, you know, there's a line in that poem, I existed with God and the piano together before time began, or something like that. You know, that poem is general. It's not really about me. It's about the fact that, despite the fact that you learn your craft and you go through all these supposed influences, if your original voice of any type, you got to really connect it into something that you knew when you were 2 years old before, that is the DNA of you, and that was before you studied your instrument and all that. So, there's a lot of kind of metaphysical prose poems about both trying to, deal with history, at the same time trying to really connect to something that's innate to you that you alone know, because that's your secret that you were given by the universe, God, whatever, or first cause, whatever you want to call it. And I did a lot of the pieces in some way deal with that type of quest.
Yeah, there's an amazing part in here that I was really struck by. Yeah, there's a part where you say, I would not push one note down on the instrument if I could portray my position in the void in my headspace without playing. When playing, I'm aiming for that silence. I'm aiming for that meditational space where formlessness becomes form, where nothingness becomes something. And if I could portray that beautiful garden without playing it, by telepathically communicating that headspace to the audience, I would do it. But the way society is structured, since I call myself a professional piano player, I have to actually play the piano at my concerts. I thought that was, yeah. It's just, I mean, you're definitely like getting pretty deep into this stuff, and the book is like, it sparks a lot of, thought, like delving into this stuff. And obviously, yeah, and Cliff's book too goes into some of that stuff, and also gets like deep into like linguistics and poetics and stuff like that. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about like in your book, like getting beyond music, like kind of looking past it into like those other kind of more heady types of themes, and like what that meant to your research?
Yeah, sure. I'll try my best. And if I had the opportunity to rewrite that section, I mean, I could probably revise it endlessly, but we don't unfortunately have that, always have that opportunity. But it came through talking with Matt, talking with artists who participated in, interviews, and the centrality of Steve Dalchinsky and Logos and Language, the book that Matt and Steve did together for Rogart. It seemed like a good way to play around with those ideas, and I liked really having the sandbox to explore some things that a lot of times, say as a liner note writer, although I'm getting a little more comfortable with it now, or as a quote unquote critic, people say editors, such as the position you've been in, I would say, can we cut some of this, this cosmic stuff, and just focus on what is at hand. Being able to spend so much time with Matt, not only listening to his music, but also just breaking bread with him over the years and hanging out, I felt comfortable that I could explore those ideas, even if I don't necessarily have like a definitive shape to them. That I really enjoyed the opportunity to get into areas that were maybe a little questing, and maybe not so pat or comfortable in my own thinking as I engaged in music. And I mean, certainly some of that, like I had an easy, not an easy time, but I felt like it was a natural fit to explore those ideas with Matt, and with in our conversations. But yeah, it was also to me a hinge on which a lot of things were based, even if I wasn't always able to construct it in sort of a perfect way. That so much of the music and so much of what is talked about through interviews rested on the idea of language and spirituality, which is not a new idea at all. I mean, it's ancient. So it's old as it gets, exactly. And my father, as a psychoanalyst and a writer, and somebody who's deeply interested in philosophy in a variety of forms. It certainly dovetails with some of the things he's written and think about. See, I'm great at this. Thought about over the decades. So, but yeah, it was a way to get in the weeds or get in the sandbox a little bit too.
And also, I would say, my generation had to go at dealing with things like that in a different way than, say, Sun Ra did. Because Sun Ra did what Sun Ra did. I'm not going to put on a robe and try to pretend to be. But I'm different generations, so he was a big influence on trying to define a cosmic jazz, as was Alice Coltrane. Actually, Alice more than John Coltrane in some ways, because she really delved in. You think of John Coltrane as a jazz musician who then kind of, went through the middle phase and then, Where Love Supreme, and then went, really whatever society calls out. Whereas Alice, you think of her really centralized in that kind of cosmic music theme. But that is being picked up on a lot now, and maybe the kind of, I don't want to say commercialization of the image of Alice Coltrane, but the kind of modern acceptance of that, picks up on that. But I'm really looking to go at it in a whole different way. I'm really involved with a quest to understand, like, why people even play the instrument, or as I say, even get out of bed in the morning. It's a mystery to me why you even wake up sometimes. But anyway.
Yeah, I think the thing that Cliff said about the sandbox thing, like, you really feel that in both these books. Like, there's kind of like this free space for, like, kind of riffing on really whatever, and they go pretty far out, but they're always like it's always kind of like a trip worth taking. So yeah, I encourage you to pick both these up for sure. And also, I think read them together. I think that's a good, even though they weren't intended that way, I think that they really kind of have like a yin-yang relationship when you read them side by side. I don't know, should we see if people have questions and things like that, or anything else that y'all wanted to get into?
It's been a real wonderful experience getting to work with Matt over the years and getting to know him.
No, it's not.
It's been really far out, and then to have this Black Mystery School Pianists and other writings has also crystallized things for me that, whatever the next thing, either on him or somebody else that I write.
Yeah, what is the next book for you?
That's it.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe a book of, badly informed recipes. I don't know. No, I have some ideas, but I cannot disclose them yet.
Cookbook is not a bad idea.
Yeah, there's already Jazz Cooks, which that's a good
like
one.
Ed Williams cooking stuff then.
Oh yeah, Webb's yeah.
As I understand, yes, it's what to go.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, I don't know what's next for me, but the fact that, now we have the Black Mystery School Pianists and other writings, that will certainly inform part of whatever it is.
Right.
I'm sure.
Do we want to do questions? If people have questions, if you do, great. If not,
I don't know if the cord reaches that long, so just
I don't know. Yeah, if anyone wants to talk about anything that we didn't talk about, but buy the books for sure. That would be my parting words.
I have a question, actually.
I can hear you.
You can hear me.
Yeah. AC/DC is a cover band.
Yeah.
So you talked a bit about club culture, and I was thinking about David Mancuso or maybe perhaps Arthur Russell,
Right,
or
right,
kind
right.
of like popular crossover
Right,
way
right.
of the pyramid. Were you informed musically by this rather than, or only like culturally?
As far as David Mancuso,
Not anyone in particular.
I just want to, no, but I want to tell the story. On Facebook, I go into all these club kids. I was at 80s club, there's a bunch of Facebook. And I was just talking one time, and I said to somebody, there was an after hours club I remember going to on 3rd. around between A and B, and I think it was called Networks, right? So I was asking, does anybody know this club? I remember, and this girl comes in and she's like, woman, she's like, I don't remember that club, but I used to see you around there at these parties. And I'm like, how do you know? She goes, you're the jazz musician. I'm like, yeah. She goes, yeah, you used to be at the loft. I saw you at a few loft parties and did.
Oh, wow.
And that's right, and I forgot he used to have parties. At one point he was on 3rd Street. And I was so drunk I don't remember those parties. But I think the whole sensibility of it really got in, because when I look back now, I was always looking for something that was other than jazz, even though there was kind of an outsider aspect to jazz, especially you get around some older people and they talk kind of mystery school type of stuff, and jazz was always this kind of underground language that as a kid I thought it could revolutionize the world and change society, but then when I got older I realized it's music. I mean, people listen to it and it might inspire them, but like the world's going to continue to be the world. Because I actually, when I was a young kid, thought that like if people really listened to like Coltrane or whatever, like the kingdom of heaven would come on the earth, and every people would stop trying to steal money from you, and the whole world. Obviously when you're 14 you think stuff like that, but anyway, that scene, what I got out of it was just a real creative. I mean, it was like a vortex of everything. It was racially mixed. Obviously it was queer culture. It became really big, and the pyramid was a big part of that. But it was just like open to everything. And it was a mix. The galleries, and this goes back to talking about Steve Dalchinsky and the open salon on Spring Street. There was a real kind of confluence between the art gallery scene, the dance clubs, even like a punk club like CBGB's. It was kind of part of the mix, and it was just all seamless, like seamless culture. You would hang in the street, and you would go to a gallery opening, and then you might go to a bookstore because somebody would, and then you could end up at a concert, and then you go dance, and then and date late at the dance club looking for drugs and sex. But it was just all seamless, I think the energy of all that was definitely, when I moved to New York, my musical ideas were already together, but I think like being thrust in that sociology did something to my brain, and I can't say exactly. I mean, not the alcohol, not talking about that doing something, but the sociology of the thing definitely did something to me. And I think you see that reflected in Basquiat's work. You really see that the energy of all I'm talking about. And Charlie Parker was his idol,
Right.
who lived on 10th Street in Avenue B. I actually lived in Charlie Parker's house for 3 months. The woman that lived there let me stay there when I was homeless in the end of in 84. So it's more of an energy, it's more of a vibe, it's more of a vortex of everything kind of in the mix, and it made me really understand that jazz is not jazz. Jazz is language, and language is open to be influenced by everything in the environment. So that's what I got at it.
Sometimes John Cage walks by, right?
Hey, it was all in the open market of New York.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Should we just mingle and chat?
Yeah.
Buy some books.
Thanks to Hank for moderating. Thanks to Rich and Sally for hosting.
Thank you.